Cryptic clues. Cryptic clues. Cryptic clues.
Welcome to my channel, where every story pulls you into a new mystery. Every case tests your instincts, and every clue brings us one step closer to the truth. In today's case, we follow Miss Marple as she notices something strange in a house long forgotten, a nursery, where the laughter had stopped years ago. Yet every night, a shadow crossed the window, one that shouldn't have been there. Stay with me till the end, because what she discovers behind that window isn't just unsettling, it's unforgettable. So, pick up your cup of tea and get comfortable, because tonight's case is worth every moment, until the very end. Chapter 1. A gathering beneath the summer sun. It was one of those rare summer afternoons in St. Mary Mead, when the sunlight seemed to rest lazily on every thatched roof, and the hedgerows hummed with bees. The vicarage garden, normally a place of modest quiet, was alive with chatter and the clink of teacups. Mrs. Clement had declared it her duty to host a garden afternoon for the children's charity, and nearly every respectable household had sent a representative. The scent of freshly baked scones drifted through the air, mingling with the sharper tang of strawberry jam and the faintest whiff of rose petals crushed underfoot. Miss Marple sat quietly near the shade of a yew hedge, a small plate balanced upon her lap. She looked rather as though she might doze at any moment, her pale blue eyes half-lidded behind her spectacles. In truth, she was listening in the particular way only Miss Marple could, gathering the fragments of conversation that floated through the air like petals on the breeze. She heard Mrs. Price Ridley declaring that young Mrs. Alcott's hat was an unfortunate choice, and that Mr. Denham had been spending altogether too much time in the company of widows. Miss Marple's expression did not change, but somewhere in the back of her mind, she filed away each remark in that precise and orderly way she had cultivated over years of observing village life. The day might have passed in unremarkable pleasantries, had it not been for little Clara Mayhew's shrill cry from the nursery window upstairs. At first, it was dismissed. Children were often prone to fancies, but the note of panic in her voice brought heads turning toward the vicarage. "There's someone in the nursery," she shouted, small hands pressed against the glass. Several guests laughed uneasily, imagining it to be a game, until Mr. Clement hurried inside. Minutes later, he reappeared in the doorway, his face pale beneath his clerical collar. The laughter faded entirely when the news spread in quick, breathless murmurs. There had been no intruder, but rather a terrible discovery. Young Emily Denham, visiting for the day, had been found upstairs in the nursery. She was quite still, quite pale, and no amount of calling her name had stirred her. By the time the doctor was fetched from the far end of the village, there was no question Emily was dead. A hush fell over the garden as guests gathered in uneasy clusters, teacups abandoned mid-sip. The soft buzz of bees seemed far too loud now, and even the sunlight had taken on a strangely cold clarity. Miss Marple did not rush to the doorway nor press forward as others did. Instead, she remained seated, watching the shifting expressions, the hurried whisper between Mrs. Price Ridley and her niece, the tightness around Mrs. Alcott's mouth, the way Mr. Denham lit a cigarette with hands that trembled only slightly. By the time the police arrived from Much Benham, gossip was already spilling across the garden paths. Some spoke of a heart condition, others of a dreadful accident with a fall from the nursery's window seat. But there was one detail, overheard from the constable's muttered account to Inspector Crail, that drew a faint, thoughtful narrowing of Miss Marple's eyes. A faint handprint smaller than an adult's, but not belonging to the victim, had been found smudged upon the inside of the nursery window. It was an odd thing, Miss Marple thought, how a quiet summer's day could turn so suddenly. Odd, too, how the tiniest detail in a room, something so easily overlooked, might tell an altogether different story than the one most people believed. And though she said nothing, merely adjusting her spectacles and sipping what remained of her now cold tea. There was a certain subtle sharpening in her gaze. The village might speak of accidents, of weak hearts and unfortunate tumbles, but Miss Marple, in her gentle and unassuming way, had already begun to suspect that the shadow in the nursery window was far more than a child's fright. Chapter 2, Whispers Along the Garden Path. Be the following morning, the story had already taken on a life of its own. In St. Mary Mead, news traveled faster than the Morning Post, and a death, particularly one that occurred in so dramatic a fashion, could not help but set tongues wagging. Mrs. Price Ridley had been among the first to call on Mrs. Clement to offer sympathy, though it was widely understood that such visits were as much about information gathering as consolation. She was observed leaving the vicarage with a look of grave importance, as though the entire weight of the village's curiosity had been placed squarely upon her shoulders. By mid-morning, she had relayed, with minor embellishments, the events of the garden party to no fewer than 6 different households. The details shifted ever so slightly with each telling, like lace unraveling in slow motion. In one version, Emily Denham had been found lying upon the nursery floor. In another, she had been discovered in the window seat itself, as if gazing out at something or someone in the snug of the Blue Boar Inn, over steaming cups of coffee. Mr. Denham was said to have looked haunted and quite done in. He was known in the village as a man of easy confidence, prone to flirtation and an unhurried manner. But on this morning, the inn's landlord, Mr. Green, reported that his hands trembled when he paid for his drink, and that he left without finishing it. Meanwhile, Mrs. Elcott's maid confided to the grocer's boy that her mistress had returned from the party, in a terrible state, having shut herself in her sitting room for hours. She had not even rung for her customary evening tea. The boy repeated this with relish to anyone who would listen, so that by noon it had reached the ears of Miss Hartnell, who promptly decided Mrs. Elcott must be in some way entangled in the matter. Miss Marple, however, spent the morning as she often did tending to her geraniums, trimming the edges of her small front garden with neat precision. Passers-by greeted her warmly, for she was well-liked, if considered a touch old-fashioned, yet beneath the benign smiles and gentle nods, she noted the quick glances exchanged between neighbors, the lowered voices when her gaze lingered. In her quiet way, she had already learned more than most. She knew, for example, that Clara Mayhew had been playing in the nursery earlier that day, and that she had a habit of collecting small treasures, marbles, buttons, scraps of ribbon, and hiding them in unusual places. She knew too that Emily Denham had been a reserved child, more often found with a book in hand than in games with the other children, and that her mother was notably protective. These small truths were not remarkable on their own, but Miss Marple had long understood that mysteries were often made of such ordinary fragments. Inspector Crail had called upon the vicarage that morning, and his presence was remarked upon almost as much as the tragedy itself. He was a tall man, with a brisk manner and a fondness for asking direct questions. Yet in a village like St. Mary Mead, directness was sometimes met with polite deflection. He had taken statements from Mrs. Clement, the Reverend, and young Clara, who remained pale and subdued, her voice barely above a whisper. Clara insisted there had been a face at the nursery window, a face she had never seen before. The inspector dismissed it as a child's fancy, perhaps a shadow cast by a passing cloud. Miss Marple, when told of this, made no such dismissal in her own mind. Shadows, she reflected, had an inconvenient habit of being more solid than they appeared. By midday, the village had settled into its familiar rhythm of speculation. The butcher remarked to Mrs. Hartnell that it was a wonder Emily had been upstairs at all during the party. Mrs. Hartnell replied knowingly that Mrs. Clement always did let the children roam where they pleased, and that it was bound to lead to trouble one day, Mrs. Price Ridley insisted, in her most confidential tone, that the Denham's marriage had been unhappy for quite some time, and that one never knows what these situations can drive people to. And somewhere between the fishmonger's stall and the post office, the theory emerged that Emily's death might not have been accidental at all, but the result of something sinister. The word was whispered, as if to speak it aloud might invite some lurking evil into the street. Miss Marple was not one to contribute to the rumor mill, but neither did she discourage it. People were inclined to talk more freely when they felt they were sharing a confidence with someone who would never repeat it, and Miss Marple, with her soft voice and kind eyes, gave precisely that impression. She listened, knitting needles clicking gently in her lap when she paused on her front porch that afternoon, making mental note of who said what, and more importantly how they said it. The guilty, she knew, often took care to say nothing at all. It was the anxious, the fearful, and the self-conscious who revealed themselves in the manner of their speaking. Late in the day, Mrs. Clement herself came to call on Miss Marple. Her hands twisting in the folds of her skirt, she spoke in a low voice of the shock, the horror, and the pity of it all. But her gaze flickered when Miss Marple asked quietly about the layout of the nursery. "The window seat faces the garden, does it not?" Miss Marple asked, her tone as casual as if discussing the weather. Mrs. Clement nodded. "One can see nearly the whole of the lawn from there," she replied, then seemed to remember herself, and added, "But of course, the children often just like to play there." When her visitor had gone, Miss Marple sat for a time in the quiet, watching the light fade over the rooftops. Somewhere in the distance, a blackbird sang its evening song, sweet and untroubled. Yet there was a tension in the air that did not belong to the natural order of things. She had seen it before in other places, at other times the way a community shifted, subtly but unmistakably, when something dark had crept into its midst. There was, she thought, a shadow still hanging over that nursery window, and not just in the mind of a frightened child. And though the village would chatter itself hoarse with its own theories, Miss Marple suspected that the truth, when it came, would prove far more unsettling than anyone yet dared to say aloud. Chapter 3. Threads in the quiet morning after Mrs. Clement's visit, the village woke under a thin gray sky, the sort that dulled the colors of the cottages and made the cobblestones glisten faintly. From the night's drizzle, St. Mary Mead felt subdued. Though not silent, there was a new sort of energy in the air, a hum that was equal parts curiosity and unease. The death of Emily Denham had taken root in every mind, and though the villagers busied themselves with their usual chores, their conversations kept circling back to the same topic. In the bakery, talk of bread prices turned into speculation about the handprint found on the nursery window. At the post office, someone remarked that Mr. Denham had been seen pacing his garden at an odd hour the night before. Each passing hour seemed to grow the story, like ivy creeping over stone. Miss Marple, however, did not allow herself to be swept along by the shifting versions. She had long ago learned that the first few days after such an event were a muddle of half-truths, overheard remarks, and imaginative additions. What mattered most to her was not the story as it was told, but the small consistencies that never quite changed, no matter whose voice carried them. She left her cottage that morning with her shopping basket and a purposeful slowness, stopping to exchange pleasantries with those she met along the lane. Her knitting was tucked neatly within the basket, though she had no particular intention of using it in the grocer's. She simply knew that people spoke more freely to a woman who appeared to be about her quiet, domestic business. Her first call was at Mrs. Simmons' dairy. Mrs. Simmons was a woman whose ears seemed to collect gossip as her shelves collected jars of cream. She was in fine form that morning, eager to recount how Mrs. Denham, Emily's mother, had refused to come to the vicarage since the tragedy. "Can't blame her," Poor soul, Mrs. Simmons said, her voice low but her eyes bright with interest. But between you and me, she's never been quite settled here, always keeping to herself. And Mr. Denham, well, he's a charming man, but charming can be dangerous, if you take my meaning. Miss Marple murmured something sympathetic, but in her mind she noted the emphasis on Mr. Denham's charms, and the faint curl of distaste in Mrs. Simmons' mouth. When speaking of Mrs. Denham's reserved dot at the grocer's, young Tommy Pierce was stacking tins, his mind clearly more on the matter at hand than on the neatness of the display. When Miss Marple asked after the Mayhews, Tommy mentioned quite without prompting that Clara had been sent to her aunt's house for a few days. They said she's frightened still, he explained. Keeps saying she saw someone in the window even though they tell her she didn't. His tone was half dismissive, half curious. Funny thing is, he added, lowering his voice, my mum says Clara's the sort that notices things other folks don't, always picking up bits no one else sees. Miss Marple allowed herself a small, almost invisible nod, for that was precisely the sort of child whose words could not be so easily set aside. By midday, Miss Marple had arranged her errands so as to pass by the vicarage. The garden still bore the faint marks of the party-folding chairs stacked near the gate. A stray paper napkin, caught in the hedge, she paused, admiring a cluster of lilies near the path when Mrs. Clement herself appeared at the doorway. Her face was drawn, but her manner was composed. Miss Marple's gentle inquiry about the Reverend's health led, in that roundabout way of village conversation, to a description of the previous afternoon. Mrs. Clement spoke of the children's laughter earlier in the day, of Emily sitting apart with a book, and of Clara's sudden cry from the window. She described finding the nursery door ajar, and a faint smell in the room, something sharp, like polish or perhaps furniture cleaner that she had not noticed before. It was said without any suggestion of importance, but Miss Marple caught it and stored it away. Later that day, she saw Inspector Crail crossing the lane toward the vicarage. He acknowledged her politely, but with the distracted air of a man with pressing matters. Miss Marple had always found that such men often overlook the obvious. In their search for the decisive, Crail was thorough, to be sure, but he had a policeman's mind, trained to expect clear cause and effect, not the meandering subtleties of human behavior. Miss Marple had no intention of interfering, but she was quietly determined to observe where he did not. That evening, she sat by her parlor fire, the steady rhythm of her knitting needles marking the passing minutes. She thought of the nursery, a quiet room in daylight, but on that afternoon a place of whispers and shadows. A child at the window, another lying still upon the floor or seat, a handprint not belonging to the victim, the smallest shifts in posture, the smallest changes in expression, they were all there, if one had the patience to remember them exactly. And patience, Miss Marple thought, was one thing she possessed in abundance. The village might be eager for an arrest, for the satisfaction of naming a culprit, but she knew that such haste often clouded the truth. People revealed themselves, slowly, in the space between their words and their silences. Somewhere among the polite smiles and murmured condolences lay the thread that would unravel the whole matter. She could almost feel it between her fingers, delicate but strong. She would not tug at it, yet not until she was certain which way it led. Chapter 4. The first shadows of suspicion. The following day dawned brighter, a pale sunlight falling across St. Mary Mead with deceptive gentleness, as though the village could be coaxed back into its familiar rhythm. Yet beneath the surface, conversations moved like slow undercurrents, pulling at half-formed thoughts and lingering doubts. The shock of Emily Denham's death had begun to settle, but in its place crept a quieter, sharper kind of curiosity, one that sought shape and reason. No one spoke openly of murder, not yet, but the idea hovered unspoken in the pauses between sentences. Inspector Crale's presence in the village was now a daily fixture, his broad figure appearing at doorways and in shop fronts, his notebook filling steadily with remarks from those who had attended the garden party. The first name to stir murmurs of suspicion was, perhaps predictably, Mr. Denham himself. The combination of his cool charm and the village's awareness of his less-than disciplined affections made for easy theorizing. Mrs. Hartnell was overheard telling the haberdasher that a man too fond of other ladies was capable of anything, while Mrs. Price Ridley, lowering her voice to a stage whisper, remarked that he had looked entirely too calm for a bereaved father. It mattered little that grief did not wear the same expression on every face. Once a notion took root in St. Mary Mead, it tended to grow quickly. Miss Marple listened without comment, as she so often did. She was not yet persuaded of Mr. Denham's guilt. Indeed, his smooth self-control, while unusual, did not necessarily speak of wrongdoing, but she noticed how carefully he avoided speaking of the hours leading up to the discovery. His account was neat, precise, and most telling of all slightly rehearsed, as though he had gone over it in his mind until it contained neither unnecessary detail nor the slightest deviation. That, Miss Marple thought, was rarely the way an entirely innocent man spoke. Other names emerged in the chatter. Mrs. Elcott's nervous retreat into her own home after the party had made her a subject of interest. Her maid, who lacked the discretion of her betters, told Mrs. Simmons that she had found a pair of children's gloves tucked into the folds of Mrs. Elcott's dress when preparing it for pressing. They were not Mrs. Elcott's size, nor did she have any children of her own. The maid claimed her mistress had snatched them away with unusual haste, insisting they were a gift to be returned to their rightful owner. Whether this was harmless or not, the details spread, and by mid-morning, Mrs. Elcott was being spoken of in lowered tones at the post office. Clara Mayhew's name, too, began to weave into the talk, though most considered her only a frightened witness. Her insistence that she had seen someone at the nursery window refused to fade. A few dismissed it as fancy, but others wondered if she had indeed glimpsed the intruder before they vanished. Mrs. Clement admitted to Miss Marple in a hushed aside that Clara had not spoken much since, save to repeat the same assertion with the stubborn clarity of a child who knows she is not believed. Miss Marple, moving quietly among these threads of conversation, found herself at the vicarage once more. The party chairs had been taken in, the lawns restored to order, but the nursery windows remained closed. She asked Mrs. Clement, with apparent absent-mindedness, whether the room had been locked since that day. Mrs. Clement replied that it had not, though she thought the inspector might request it. "It feels strange, passing the door," she admitted, "as though the air in there is different." She laughed softly, embarrassed, but Miss Marple only nodded, for she had heard such remarks before. Tragedy, she knew, had a way of settling into the corners of a place. On her way home, Miss Marple encountered Inspector Crale speaking with the Reverend Clement near the church gate. She paused at a polite distance, appearing to study the flower beds, but Crale's voice carried clearly enough in the still air. He was questioning the Reverend about the timing of events the moment Clara cried out. The guest's movements, who had entered the house first. The Reverend was exact, but it was clear he disliked the implication that someone among his parishioners might be under suspicion. Crale, for his part, gave little away, though his gaze swept the street in a way that suggested his net was already cast wide. That evening, the talk in the Blue Boar was thick with speculation. A young man from Much Benham claimed to have seen a stranger walking along the lane toward the vicarage just before the garden party began, a tall figure in a dark coat, unusual for the warmth of the day. Whether this was truth, invention, or a memory bent to fit the current drama, none could say. But the idea of an outsider mingling unseen among them stirred both fascination and unease. Miss Marple, seated by her fire, considered it carefully. Villages, she thought, often blamed strangers for their troubles, for it was more comfortable than imagining the culprit was someone known to them. And yet, from long experience, she also knew that danger had a curious habit of wearing a familiar face. She took out her knitting, the needles moving with their unhurried rhythm. The names, the glances, the fragments of overheard speech, these were the stitches forming in her mind, each to be placed precisely where it belonged. Already, she could see the first faint outline of the pattern. Not the whole design, oh no. That would take time, but enough to know that the shadows in St. Mary Mead had not yet revealed their darkest shapes, and in that gentle, unassuming way of hers, Miss Marple resolved to keep her eyes open a little wider in the days to come. Chapter 5. A detail overlook. More days passed, and the mood in St. Mary Mead began to shift again. The shock of Emily Denham's death had dulled at the edges, but what replaced it was a restless tension, as though the village itself were holding its breath. People no longer spoke of the tragedy with the same hushed tones. Instead, conversations carried a sharper undercurrent, shaped by the emerging lines of suspicion. Inspector Crail had begun calling on the same households for a second time. His questions more precise now, his manner polite but edged with purpose. If he was closing in on a suspect, he gave no hint of it, but there was a growing sense that certain people were being watched more closely than others. Miss Marple had no need for formal interviews. Her manner of inquiry was subtler and far less likely to provoke guarded answers. She called at Mrs. Elcott's cottage under the pretext of bringing a jar of her prized gooseberry jam, a small courtesy that no one could possibly refuse. Mrs. Elcott looked pale, her dark hair pinned neatly, but without the careful arrangement she usually maintained. She accepted the gift with thanks, but seemed eager to keep the visit brief. Miss Marple, appearing to take no notice of her hostess's discomfort, remarked gently on the fine view from the upstairs rooms, especially toward the vicarage garden. Mrs. Elcott hesitated just a fraction, but long enough for Miss Marple to note it. "One does see rather a lot from there," she agreed, before quickly changing the subject to her rose bushes. From there, Miss Marple strolled toward the High Street, where she encountered young Clara Mayhew's aunt outside the greengrocer's. The woman was busy selecting apples, but when Miss Marple inquired after Clara's health, she paused to say that the girl was quite herself now, though she remained firm in her story about the face at the nursery window. "She says it was a lady," the aunt added reluctantly, "but won't say who. I'm not sure she even knows." Miss Marple received this news with a small, considering smile. Children's memories could be tricky things, sometimes clearer than adults imagined, sometimes blurred by fear and suggestion, but the insistence on a lady was interesting. It narrowed the possibilities in a way that gossip had not yet done. That afternoon, while the village busied itself with its small routines, Miss Marple took a slow walk past the vicarage once more. She paused at the garden gate, noting how the late summer flowers leaned lazily in the breeze, and how the nursery windows caught the light. It was then that she spotted Inspector Crail emerging from the house, his brow furrowed. They exchanged polite greetings, and in a tone almost conversational, she remarked on the difficulty of piecing together the exact sequence of events. During such a busy afternoon, Crail agreed, though his tone suggested mild impatience. "Too many people, too many stories," he said, "and everyone's memory conveniently changes to suit their own account." As he spoke, Miss Marple's gaze drifted upward to the nursery window. The panes had been cleaned since the day of the party, yet a faint smudge still marked the lower corner of one. It might have been nothing, a streak left by a careless cloth, but she noted its position carefully. If a child had pressed their hand there, they would have had to stand on the seat, looking outward, and if the handprint found on the day was smaller than Emily's, as she had overheard, Then someone else entirely had been at that window before the alarm was raised. The following morning brought a small but telling piece of news. Mrs. Simmons, delivering milk to the Denhams, claimed to have overheard a sharp exchange between Mr. and Mrs. Denham through the open kitchen window. Though she could not make out every word, she was certain she heard Mrs. Denham say, "You promised me it would end," to which Mr. Denham replied, "It has if you'd only believe me." By the time this story reached Miss Marple, it had been softened in some tellings and sharpened in others, but she was experienced enough to recognize the core of truth that gossip often carried. It was in the evening, sitting in her parlor with her knitting, that Miss Marple began to see the shape of something taking form. The facts were still scattered, the motives half hidden, but there was a pattern, faint but undeniable. The girl had died in a room that was not locked, in the midst of a gathering where nearly everyone knew one another. A child claimed to have seen a woman at the window, and there were two women in particular, Mrs. Alcott and Mrs. Denham, whose movements during that hour remained curiously vague. And then there was the question of the gloves in Mrs. Alcott's possession, and her view of the garden from her upper windows. Miss Marple did not yet know the truth, but she felt its presence close at hand, like a shadow just beyond the reach of lamplight. She would not tug at it too soon. People in St. Mary Mead revealed themselves in time, often without realizing they were doing so, and she, with her quiet persistence, would be ready when they did. Chapter 6. The past that lingers. The sun was already high over St. Mary Mead when Miss Marple stepped out of her cottage the next morning, a straw hat shading her pale eyes from the glare. It was one of those deceptive days, all light and warmth, as if the village's troubles could be swept aside with a turn of the season. Yet to Miss Marple, the air felt unsettled. She had learned over the years that grief and guilt could hide in bright weather just as easily as in gloom, and that people often spoke more freely when the world looked harmless. Her walk took her toward the far end of the village, where the Denham's house stood behind a row of clipped privet hedges. She had no intention of knocking. There was nothing to be gained in making her interest too obvious, but she passed slowly enough to notice the curtains drawn in one of the upper rooms. Despite the fine morning, at the gate, Mrs. Denham appeared quite suddenly, as though she had been waiting for someone to pass. She greeted Miss Marple with a polite nod, her expression composed, though her eyes carried the faint shadows of sleeplessness. In a voice that was courteous yet strained, she inquired after the vicar's wife, then made some remark about the late roses blooming earlier than expected this year. It was ordinary conversation, but Miss Marple detected the stiffness beneath it, the careful choice of harmless topics. Later, in the grocer's, Miss Marple found herself beside Mrs. Price Ridley, who had already gathered a small audience for her morning recital of events. "You mark my words," she declared, weighing a packet of tea in her hand. "There's more to that family than meets the eye. I heard from Mrs. Simmons herself that Mr. Denham was seen speaking with Mrs. Alcott in the lane last Thursday long, before any of this happened, and they stopped talking the moment they were seen." This tidbit was met with raised brows and knowing glances, though Miss Marple merely smiled faintly and asked the grocer whether the new shipment of sugar had arrived. By the afternoon, another fragment of the past had floated to the surface. In the Blue Boar, over the clink of glasses, the landlord mentioned to Mr. Clement that Mrs. Alcott had once been engaged to a man who left her abruptly for another woman, none other than Mrs. Denham, before her marriage. This, if true, was the kind of old wound that could be smoothed over in public, but might still sting in private. Miss Marple, hearing this later from Mr. Clement himself, reflected on how human tempers could lie dormant for years, only to flare again when circumstances brought the right people together. That evening, she took tea with Mrs. Clement, who was still unsettled by the presence of the police in her home. The vicar's wife spoke of Inspector Crale's questions, his interest in the timing of the guests' movements, and his insistence on knowing who had been inside the house in the half hour before Clara's cry. "It makes one feel as though we're all on trial," Mrs. Clement said with a nervous laugh. Miss Marple, her hands folded neatly in her lap, murmured that in a way everyone was, if only in the inspector's mind. She asked, as though idly, whether Mrs. Elcott had been among those in the house just before the discovery. Mrs. Clement thought she had, but could not recall exactly when she had gone upstairs. Miss Marple walked home under a deepening sky, the first cool hint of evening touching the air. The pattern in her mind was beginning to take on color now, not just shape. There were the old grievances between Mrs. Elcott and Mrs. Denham, the curious matter of the children's gloves, the drawn curtains at the Denham house, and the child's unwavering claim to have seen a woman at the nursery window. These threads might yet be unrelated, but experience told her they were more likely to be bound together, each knot tied by something in the human heart rather than by chance. She set her knitting on her lap as she sat by the window, the last of the light glinting on the silver needles. There was still much to learn, but the truth, whatever form it took, was moving closer, and Miss Marple, with her quiet patience, intended to be there when it arrived. Chapter 7. Uneasy conversations 2 mornings later. The village awoke to the faint sound of hammering from the vicarage, where a carpenter had been called to replace the latch on the nursery door. The rhythmic strikes carried across the garden walls, a small but constant reminder that something in that quiet house had been disturbed, and that the disturbance had yet to be set right. By now, the garden party felt like a lifetime ago, though the image of Emily Denham's stillness lingered in the minds of those who had been there. The more days passed, the more the villagers seemed to fill the gaps in their knowledge with their own inventions, until even the most outlandish suggestions were met with a half-believing nod. Miss Marple found herself invited to take tea at Mrs. Elcott's cottage that afternoon, a development she regarded with some interest. It was Mrs. Elcott herself who extended the invitation when they met in the lane, her voice light but her eyes holding a quick, assessing flicker. The sitting room was tidy, though the air held the faint scent of something floral lavender, perhaps, or a perfume dabbed on in haste. Miss Marple accepted her tea with polite thanks. Remarking on the view from the front windows, Mrs. Elcott smiled briefly, but did not offer to show her guest the view from upstairs, which Miss Marple considered telling in its own way. Their talk meandered through the safe channels of village life, flowers, church events, the uncertain weather, but the rhythm faltered when Miss Marple, in a tone as mild as warm milk, mentioned that children's gloves could be such delicate things to keep track of. Mrs. Elcott set her cup down a fraction too quickly, the saucer giving a faint clink, before recovering herself with a vague comment about the many small items that went missing in busy households. Leaving the cottage, Miss Marple took the long way back through the high street, where she encountered Mrs. Denham in the milliner's shop. The younger woman was examining a bolt of pale blue ribbon, but seemed distracted, her smile forced when she greeted Miss Marple. They exchanged pleasantries, yet there was a slight edge to Mrs. Denham's manner, as though she were politely holding a door shut between them. It was in the small silences between her words that Miss Marple sensed the weight of something unspoken, resentment perhaps, or fear, but she did not press. People were more likely to reveal themselves when they felt no one was looking for the reveal. That evening, Miss Marple's neighbor, Mr. Bowden, called by with a delivery of eggs from his hens. As he set the basket on her table, he mentioned in a low, confidential tone that Inspector Crail had been at the Blue Boar again, speaking with the landlord about a stranger seen in the village the week before the party. Tall fellow, dark coat, Mr. Bowden said, shaking his head, but no one's seen him since. Could have been passing through, but the inspector seems to think otherwise. Miss Marple listened, her hands resting lightly on the edge of the table. and wondered whether the inspector was chasing a shadow of his own making, or whether the stranger, if he existed, was merely another piece of the puzzle. The next day brought another small observation, though it was not Miss Marple who first noticed it. Clara Mayhew's aunt mentioned, in conversation outside the post office, that the child had been calmer of late, though she still spoke of the lady at the window. What struck her aunt as odd was that Clara now insisted the lady had been wearing something light, rather than the dark figure she had first described. It was a small change, but to Miss Marple it hinted at either the natural shifting of a child's memory, or the careful correction of a story by someone eager to steer it in a particular direction. By late afternoon, Miss Marple had settled once again by her parlor fire, her knitting lying in a neat coil beside her, the names and details turned over quietly in her mind, Mrs. Elcott's sudden invitation and quickness to deflect, Mrs. Denham's strained politeness, the talk of an unknown man, and the evolving account of a frightened child. None of these stood alone as proof of anything, but together they formed a web, a pattern she could almost see. Though one or two strands were still hidden in the shadows, she knew better than to try to seize the whole at once. Instead, she would wait, letting the web tighten naturally until it caught exactly what it was meant to catch. And in that calm, deliberate way of hers, Miss Marple prepared to step a little closer to the heart of the matter, even if those involved did not yet know she was watching. Chapter 8. A Conversation in the Churchyard. Church bells had just finished striking 11 when Miss Marple walked through the light gate and into the churchyard. It was a place she often visited, ostensibly to tend the small memorial plot where her parents rested, but in truth it served another purpose. The churchyard in St. Mary Mead was a thoroughfare of sorts. Sooner or later, almost everyone passed through on their way to the high street, and those who paused often seemed inclined to speak with more candor among the quiet stones than they might in a parlor or shop. The air was still, the grass freshly cut, and the faint scent of roses drifted from the vicarage garden nearby. She was not long in waiting before Mrs. Clement appeared, walking slowly along the path, a small basket on her arm. Miss Marple greeted her warmly, and after a few remarks on the fine weather, Mrs. Clement confided that Inspector Crail had returned yet again that morning, pressing her about the guest's movements in the moments before the discovery. "He seems particularly interested in who might have gone upstairs without being noticed," she said, glancing toward the church as though wary of being overheard. "It is also unpleasant, Jane. One keeps thinking, what if it was someone we've known for years?" Miss Marple replied gently that such things were never pleasant, though they were often less surprising than one might hope. From the far side of the yard, Mr. Denham appeared, striding with that purposeful energy he seemed to adopt when he wanted to look busy. His expression shifted slightly upon seeing the two women in conversation, but he approached with a polite smile. Miss Marple noted the way his eyes flicked toward Mrs. Clement before settling on her, as though measuring whether the vicar's wife had said more than he would have liked. After a few polite exchanges, he excused himself, claiming some urgent matter at home. Mrs. Clement watched him go, her brow faintly furrowed, and murmured that he had seemed unusually attentive to Mrs. Elcott's comings and goings lately. Leaving the churchyard, Miss Marple made her way toward the lane that curved behind Mrs. Elcott's cottage. It was not her habit to spy, but she had learned that walking past at the right time could yield more than any direct question. Today, her timing proved fortuitous. Mrs. Elcott stood in her front garden speaking in low tones to a man Miss Marple did not recognize. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a way that suggested he had not expected to be seen. Dark jacket, hat brim pulled low. When their eyes met briefly, there was the faintest flicker of something guarded before he turned and walked away toward the fields. Mrs. Elcott called after him, but only with a vague "I'll see you later." as if she wanted her words to carry no weight should anyone overhear. In the afternoon, Miss Marple visited the Mayhew household under the pretext of delivering some homemade biscuits. Clara was in the garden, playing quietly with a set of painted wooden animals. Miss Marple knelt beside her, admiring the neat line of sheep and horses, and after a few moments asked, almost as though it had just occurred to her, whether the lady in the nursery window had been wearing something pretty. Clara nodded solemnly. It was soft, she said after a pause, like a dress you'd wear to tea. The child's tone was matter-of-fact, uncolored by fear now, and it made Miss Marple think again about the subtle shift in Clara's description. Soft and light, rather than dark, perhaps not a memory altered by time, but a truth being slowly clarified. By the time she returned home, the day was sliding toward evening. The lamps in the cottages began to glow, and the scent of supper's cooking drifted on the air. Sitting in her armchair, Miss Marple reflected on the day's small harvest, Mr. Denham's unease at seeing her with Mrs. Clement, the unknown man speaking with Mrs. Alcott, Clara's quiet insistence on the lady in the light dress. They were pieces still scattered, still incomplete, but they belonged to the same puzzle. She was certain of it now. The trick, as always, would be to place them without forcing the fit too soon. The web she had been watching was tightening, but not yet enough to catch its intended prey. For now, she would let it spin a little longer, while she remained exactly where she seemed least dangerous on the periphery, with her knitting and her gentle questions, hearing more than anyone suspected. Miss Marple lingered by her front window that evening, the fading light slanting through the lace curtains. From here, she could see the lane curving toward the vicarage and in the opposite direction, toward the Alcott cottage. It was a quiet stretch at this hour, disturbed only by the occasional passing of a cart or the flap of wings from the rooks, gathering in the tall elms. But her mind was anything but still. The image of Mrs. Alcott speaking with the stranger refused to settle into a harmless explanation, however much she turned it over. His deliberate departure at the sight of her, and Mrs. Alcott's restrained call after him, had the air of an arrangement not meant for open display. She took out her knitting, the wool sliding softly through her fingers, and let her thoughts play back over the day. The man's height, the set of his shoulders, and the way his coat seemed better suited to city pavements than to village lanes. None of these belonged to someone here for casual acquaintance. And yet, if he were entirely unknown to Mrs. Alcott, why should she speak to him in such familiar tones? It was the kind of question that yielded nothing by direct attack. Better to let it rest until it could be approached from another angle. The next morning, she rose early and stepped out into a cool, pearly dawn. The postman was already on his rounds, and she met him just outside her gate. "Nothing much today, Miss Marple," he said cheerfully, handing her a single envelope and a folded newspaper. But there was the faintest hesitation before he moved on, as if he had remembered something worth mentioning. "Come to think of it," he added, "I've had a couple of letters through lately addressed to Mrs. Alcott in handwriting I don't know. London postmark." Miss Marple murmured her thanks and tucked this detail away. Letters from London might mean nothing but in a village where so much was known about everyone. Unfamiliar correspondence was rarely overlooked. Later, while arranging her flowers, Miss Marple received a visit from Mrs. Simmons, the dairyman's wife, who never required much encouragement to talk. Between remarks about the butter supply and the price of feed, she let slip that she had once seen Mrs. Alcott standing for a long while by the gate of the Denham property, apparently waiting. She said she was admiring the roses, Mrs. Simmons recounted with a wry smile, but she looked more like someone expecting company. Miss Marple's only response was a soft hum of interest, but her mind was already adding the observation to the day's growing tally. By afternoon, the village lanes were busy again, and Miss Marple took the opportunity to stroll toward the fields. near the stile leading to the footpath. She saw a faint impression in the damp earth, a man's footprint, she thought, larger than most of the local farmers' boots and with a city shoe's narrower cut. It was impossible to say for certain it belonged to the stranger, but its location was telling. The path led toward the far edge of the Elcott property, away from the main road. She stood there for a few moments, seemingly lost in contemplation of the hedgerow, before continuing on. Back at her cottage, she brewed herself a fresh pot of tea and reflected on the threads she had gathered. The unknown man, the letters from London, Mrs. Elcott's unexplained movements, and Clara Mayhew's unwavering memory of a lady in a light dress at the nursery window. These were not the wild imaginings of idle gossip. They had shape, even if the full outline was still faint. She suspected that somewhere between these details lay the point, where past grievances met present opportunity, and that Emily Denham's quiet watchfulness from the window seat had placed her in the path of something she could not have understood. Miss Marple sipped her tea and glanced once more toward the lane. In a village like St. Mary Mead, secrets never remained entirely behind closed doors. It was only a matter of finding the right angle from which to see through the glass, and for that she was content to wait patiently, unobtrusively, until the moment came when someone, without even knowing it, would tell her exactly what she needed to hear. Chapter 9. The Stitch Titenth. Next morning began with a heavy mist that clung low over the hedgerows and made the roofs of St. Mary Mead look as though they were suspended in cloud. Miss Marple rather liked such mornings. People, she had found, often spoke more freely when the day felt enclosed, as if the mist might keep their words from traveling too far. She left her cottage with her shopping basket, heading first to the baker's for a loaf, then on toward the greengrocer's, where she found Mrs. Price Ridley already holding court. The topic, unsurprisingly, was still Emily Denham's death, though Mrs. Price Ridley now spoke of it with a certainty that implied she had long known. It would come to something like this when pressed to elaborate. She hinted darkly about old matters best left unsaid and glanced meaningfully toward the Denham house. Miss Marple, in her usual way, did not challenge the remark but merely allowed it to settle. Old matters had a way of working themselves to the surface when the present became troubled, and she wondered how much of Mrs. Price Ridley's talk was invention, and how much came from some half-remembered truth. By mid-morning, she had gathered a small collection of such fragments. Mrs. Denham seen walking alone in the fields. 2 days before the party, Mrs. Elcott overheard asking the postmistress whether any letters had arrived from London, and a remark from Mr. Bowden about hearing a man's raised voice in the lane after dark. Her most telling encounter of the day came quite unexpectedly. She was returning home along the lane when she met Inspector Crail, who was emerging from Mrs. Elcott's gate. His expression was one of guarded satisfaction, though he offered nothing beyond a brief good morning and a remark about the weather. Miss Marple, noting the faint smudge of dust on his coat sleeve, guessed he had been upstairs. That would mean he had been inspecting the view from the upper windows, a view which, she herself had considered, might show precisely who had been in the vicarage garden at the critical moment. In the afternoon, Miss Marple paid a call on Mrs. Clement under the guise of delivering a jar of damson jelly. The vicar's wife, perhaps feeling the need for company, spoke at greater length than usual about the day of the garden party. She mentioned, almost absently, that just before Clara's cry was heard, she had gone upstairs to fetch a fresh tablecloth. On the landing, she had heard movement in the nursery, but assumed it was one of the children. When I went in, she said, there was no one, of course, except Emily and she. Well, you know, she trailed off, her voice unsteady. Miss Marple laid a comforting hand on her arm, but inside her mind a small piece clicked into place. Mrs. Clement had been upstairs in those final minutes, and she had heard someone leave the room before she entered. That someone had not been seen going down the stairs, That evening, the mist lifted, leaving the village bathed in the pale light of a waxing moon. Miss Marple sat in her parlor, her knitting in her lap, the needles momentarily still. The picture was becoming clearer, the unseen presence in the nursery, the smudge on the window, the child's insistence on a lady in a light dress, the tangle of old feelings between Mrs. Elcott and Mrs. Denham. And now this an unaccounted movement in the very moments before the tragedy was discovered. The stitch was tightening, not enough yet to pull the whole fabric into view, but enough for Miss Marple to feel its tension under her fingers. She knew the moment was coming when she would have to set the final snare, one that would seem entirely harmless until it caught exactly the person it was meant to catch. And when that happened, the truth long buried under politeness, habit, and the quiet deceptions of village life would have no choice but to step into the light. That night, the village lay under a soft hush, the moonlight spilling like pale silk over the rooftops. From her bedroom window, Miss Marple could see the faint glimmer of lamplight from the Denhams' upper rooms. It burned later than she might have expected, a small, stubborn glow against the darkness. She wondered who sat wakeful there, whether it was grief, fear, or something else entirely that kept them from rest. Ticking marking the last hours before morning, she moved away from the window and settled at her writing desk, her pen poised over a sheet of paper. It was not a letter she meant to send, but a simple exercise she often used when threads were tangled, a list written in her small, neat hand, names, times, and the curious little details that would mean nothing to most people, but meant a great deal to her. A smudge on a window pane, a pair of children's gloves, a man in a dark coat speaking softly to Mrs. Elcott, a child's shifting memory of a light-colored dress, and at the heart of it all, an old resentment between two women, dressed in politeness but never quite healed. Outside, a branch scraped softly against the wall, the sound like the faint dragging of cloth over stone. It made her think of the nursery, its closed windows, the too quiet air Mrs. Clement had described. She could almost imagine the moment, just before Clara's cry, a figure standing in that stillness, the faint creak of the window seat, the sudden turn of the head at some noise below. And then what? Words exchanged, a hand reaching out, or the silence broken only by the sound of a child's frightened breath. She set down her pen and closed the notebook. The picture was clear enough now, though a few pieces still rested in shadow. But those shadows would not last much longer. People, Miss Marple knew, could carry a secret for years, but when they were pressed, gently and without warning, it was often their own voice that betrayed them. She looked toward the mantel clock, its steady ticking marking the last hours before morning. Tomorrow, she decided, she would draw them all together, not with accusations or grand speeches, but with tea, cake, and the kind of harmless conversation in which the truth could slip out as easily as a dropped stitch in her knitting. And when it did, the shadow that had fallen over the nursery window would finally be given its name. Chapter 10. The Quiet Unraveling. Next afternoon was one of those rare autumn days when the air felt as crisp as an apple, and the sunlight slanted through the trees in mellow gold. It was, Miss Marple decided, the perfect day for a little tea gathering. She sent out a few short notes that morning, one to Mrs. Elcott, another to Mr. and Mrs. Denham, and one to the vicarage inviting them to join her at 4 o'clock for tea and seed cake. Nothing in her tone hinted at anything unusual. Indeed, the invitations seemed nothing more than the harmless hospitality she had offered many times before. When they arrived, they found the sitting room cheerful and unthreatening, the tea table set with a neat array of cups and saucers, sandwiches, and a large plate of Miss Marple's light sponge. Only after everyone was settled did she begin, her voice as gentle and unassuming as ever. "I have been thinking a great deal about poor little Emily," she said, pouring tea with a steady hand. "It was such a sad thing, and such a strange one too. and it occurred to me that perhaps it was stranger than anyone at first thought. There was a brief silence, broken only by the faint ticking of the clock. Miss Marple continued, her words falling in that mild, deliberate way that seemed to drift past without causing alarm. You see, it was clear from the start that someone had been in the nursery before the alarm was raised. The smudge on the window told us that, and the fact that the handprint was not Emily's. Clara Mayhew said she saw a lady there. At first, some thought she imagined it, but children notice more than they are given credit for. And she was quite right, it was a lady in a light-colored dress. Mrs. Elcott shifted slightly in her chair, her hands resting still in her lap. Miss Marple's eyes moved to her, not accusingly, but with the kind of softness that invited honesty. The question, of course, she went on, was why a lady would be in that room at all unseen. In those few minutes before Emily died, Mr. Denham gave a short laugh, meant to sound dismissive. Surely you're not suggesting, I am suggesting, Miss Marple interrupted gently, that the person in the nursery was there with a very particular purpose. Emily had seen something she was not meant to see, perhaps earlier in the day, from that window seat with its fine view of the garden. She may even have spoken of it, children do, and that something concerned an old matter, one that could cause embarrassment or worse. If it came to light, her gaze returned to Mrs. Elcott, who now sat with her eyes fixed on the teacup before her. You knew, my dear, that Emily had been watching. She saw you in the lane, with that man from London, the man no one else in the village knew, and she might have told someone. That is why you went upstairs. You meant only to warn her, perhaps frighten her into silence. But the child panicked, and in the scuffle, she fell, struck her head, and it was over in a moment. Mrs. Elcott's breath caught, and for a long second she did not speak. The room seemed to hold its own breath with her. Finally, she said, almost in a whisper, I never meant. She stopped, her voice breaking, and pressed a hand to her eyes. Miss Marple's tone was as calm as if they were discussing the weather. I believe you. But you see, one cannot leave a truth like that to lie hidden. It always finds a way to show itself. Even in the quietest of villages, Inspector Crail, who had been seated quietly in the corner at Miss Marple's invitation, though she had not mentioned it to the others, rose then and stepped forward. His expression was grave but not unkind. Mrs. Elcott, I'm afraid you'll need to come with me. No one spoke as he led her out. The only sound was the faint rustle of the autumn leaves outside and the soft clink of Miss Marple setting down her teacup. After a moment, she looked at the remaining guests and said gently, people are rarely wicked without reason, but reason, however strong, can never undo what is done. When they had gone, Miss Marple sat alone for a time, the afternoon light fading into the pale blue of evening. The village would talk for weeks. Of course it always did, but she knew that the truth would settle into its place, as it always did, and life would find its familiar rhythms again. She took up her knitting, the steady click of the needles filling the quiet. Another thread had been pulled, another pattern revealed. And as ever, it was not the grand gestures or the shouted accusations that had brought it to light, but the small things, smudges on windows, the color of a dress, the tremor in a voice that told the whole story. If one only had the patience to listen. When the door closed behind Inspector Crail and Mrs. Elcott, the room seemed to grow very still. The ticking of the clock on the mantel was suddenly loud, each second marking the space between what had just been spoken and what it would mean for the days ahead. The tea things sat untouched now, the sponge cake half cut, the pot cooling in its cozy. Miss Marple did not move to clear them away. Outside, a gust of wind stirred the branches, tapping them lightly against the glass. Mr. Denham rose stiffly, muttering something about needing to speak to his wife, and left without another glance. Mrs. Clement sat a moment longer, her eyes on the table, as though still trying to reconcile the polite figure she had known with the truth she had just heard. She left quietly, her step slow as she crossed the path to the gate. Miss Marple remained by the hearth, her knitting lying in her lap, though she had not touched it since the guests had first arrived. The fire had burned low, its embers shifting with a soft hiss. She thought of the nursery of the dust motes in the pale afternoon light, the small handprint on the window, the stillness of a child who would never grow older. Some truths, she knew, were never satisfying to uncover. They brought order, yes, but not comfort. In the lane outside, voices rose briefly, Inspector Crail giving quiet instructions, the crunch of footsteps fading toward the main road. Soon, even that was gone, and the village settled back into the muted sounds of evening, a cart rattling far off, the distant cry of a dog, the rustle of leaves in the hedgerow. Yet in that peace, Miss Marple could feel it, the subtle shift that followed such revelations. When neighbors would glance at one another a moment longer, when words would be weighed before they were spoken, life would resume, but it would not be quite the same. She reached for her knitting at last, the familiar rhythm steadying her hands. Another shadow had been brought into the open, but shadows were stubborn things. They returned in other shapes, in other houses, under other skies. And so she kept watch quietly, just as she always had, listening for the small, telling sounds that others missed, the threads that, once drawn, would unravel the whole. The fire whispered low, the needles clicked softly, and St. Mary Mead kept its secrets for now. The lamplight flickered once, casting her shadow long across the room, as if even it leaned closer to listen.